Our second session for today, monastic labor, scribes, and manuscript production. Our first presenter is Vevian Zaki. She is the cataloger of Arabic manuscripts at Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, as well as research fellow at the Institute for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at Ludwig Maximilian's University in Munich. And she'll be presenting a paper titled Scribes, Binders, and Owners of Christian Arabic Manuscripts, Nuns and Monks in the Making of Manuscripts. We also have Lauren Onel, a PhD student at Princeton University, who will be presenting a paper that's different from what we have on our program titled Female Monasticism in Cilician Armenia, Gender Boundaries and Franciscan Influence. And we also have our respondent, Evyn Kropf, who is librarian of Middle Eastern and North African Studies and Religious Studies here at UM, and also the curator of the university's Islamic Manuscripts collection. Join me in welcoming them all.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and speak about one of my favorite things, that is scribes. I love scribes, and I usually study male scribes, and then Catherine gave me the chance to study female scribes finally. And the first thing I started to do is to do an inventory of women in general in Christian Arabic manuscript, which is my field of research. And it was amazing that I really cannot find enough. I searched and find some names. I used all the Arabic and Syriac words that I can find. I can search it through, and it's still difficult to find female scribes. So I started to look in other traditions, and I was shocked because, for example, in a German convent in 200 years almost, we have 416 female scribes. But this is Germany. When I went to the Middle East, in around the area of one village, Al-Kosh, Helen Moore Vandenberg found more than 80 female scribes. All what I have found is 18 female scribes. And I searched in a very huge, the Himmel database. I'm sure you heard of it. Okay. So I started with some unanswered questions, and I still do not really have answer to them. And finally, I find myself comparing the work of a monk and the work of a nun in Christian Arabic manuscripts. This is an example of both of them, nun and the monk. Can you tell which manuscript is copied by the monk and which manuscript is copied by the nun? No, of course, this is my first point. It's non-gendered. You cannot tell by examining the manuscript that it is made by a nun or made by a monk. Mariam and Simon. To our left will be always Mariam. To your right, it will be always Simon. And here are my unanswered questions. Why the number of female scribes of Christian Arabic manuscript is lesser than other traditions, far and near in Europe and in the Middle East? And then my second question, because we are basically speaking about nuns and monks, was monasticism a step up for women and a step down for men? I will clarify this question. I will not answer it, but I will clarify it more with more slides to come. the things that I investigated in both the life and the work of Mariam and Simon is how they identified themselves as the cultural or the institutional structures that they existed in, and their education and skills. How they identified themselves, simply Simon lived in the 17th century, St. Catherine Monastery, Sinai, Egypt, and Mariam lived in the 1534, that is the 16th century, in Mardin, now Turkey. No, not in a village close to Mardin called Al-Mansouriya. And both of them identified themselves in a very simple way. They just wrote their first name and their origin. So Mariam from Al-Mansouriya, a village, and Simon from Hems, but he was at the time in Sinai in Egypt. And Mariam was in her own village. Mariam doesn't mention any monastic institutions that she belonged to. And one important thing about how they identified themselves, how they spoke in the colophons. You know, in the colophons, you find formulas that are kind of stable. Everyone will write it. Everyone will ask you, pray, please pray for me and pray for my parents. Please, if you find anything wrong, please correct it. At least in Christian Arabic manuscripts, these are very, very stable formulas across the denomination and across centuries. Simon was no exception. Simon, this is what he wrote. Please pray for my parents. Mariam didn't do this. Mariam, when she wrote, she identified, please pray for my father and my mother. And this was not the only gender-sensitive issues that she showed. When she spoke about her commissioner was also a woman, Mahabbat Allah. She identified her also by the names of her father and her mother. She knew both names. When she asked for corrections, usually would say, I urge the reader to correct whatever misspelling mistakes he finds, which applies to all genders. Mariam didn't do so. She said, I urge every brother and sister who reads this book and find misspellings or mistakes to correct them and not to blame me. All the verbs here are feminine. All the 5 verbs here are feminine. Contrasted to the absence of a more specific identification of herself, she didn't write anything about herself. She shows awareness of several other women, a deep realization of her expected women readers, and a desire to mention women who were normally neglected or included in very general terms. Mariam wrote one manuscript only, or at least this is the manuscript that we know about. And she had, as you know, the colophon usually is a paragraph, maybe a page, but in fact, she wrote 5 pages of 2 pages about manuscripts, information about the manuscript, and 3 pages about herself, writing her poetry or maybe something that she likes, and quotes other poems. So when you, in terms of space, you feel that Mariam had kind of more freedom to use the manuscript. She wrote what she wanted to write in her own terms. And the opposite case is with Simon, who was part of a very established monastic institution. He had less control of the space, or in fact, he had someone who shared with him the space. And this one is the Greek Archbishop of the monastery, Joseph or Joseph, who had this very big Greek, don't know how to, you see downstairs here is a very big Greek signature of the bishop. And also the formula that Simon did was the same almost every time, that this is, I'm writing, this manuscript belongs to me until I die, and then it becomes the position of the monastery. And I do this at the behest of Bishop Joseph, who put his signature as a verification of this. And it seems kind of a legal document more than a colophon, like I'm writing a will, I'm writing an endowment or a waqf note. I am okay, I will use this manuscript as long as I am alive, but then the manuscript moves to the library of the monastery. Both of them worked under supervision, but the supervision was very different because Mariam, as I mentioned, didn't say which monastic institution she lives in. And actually, she lived in a private house. She lived in her village. So the situation is that she comes from a village called Al-Mansuriya. She lived in this village. She's a nun. She doesn't live in a monastery, but she lives in a household, and this household is not her family's. It's a family. She mentions the name of the man. She mentions the name of the teacher of the family. She mentions them as using terms indicating that they are educated household, but we don't know why she lived in a household, why she was a nun not living in a monastic institution. At the same time, her supervision was the commissioner, who was also a woman. She didn't live in the same city, in the same village. She lived in Mardin, and somehow they seem in well communication. Like the commissioner corrected and collated the manuscript and returned it to Mariam. The commissioner is the one who bound the manuscript together. Mariam took the job of copying 320 pages of the manuscript. She's the one who divided the choirs. She's the one who makes the choir signs. She's the one who wrote the colophon and gave everyone. So it seems a very collaborative work for two women. One of them was moving. One of them, they had some communication, because it seems that the sequence is different. Like this did something, and then the other did other thing, and then the last one took it and bound it. Simon was in a very different. Simon was in a monastery. He worked in a workshop. This is a very famous workshop. I'm not the first one who mentions Simon, because plus his copying skills, he also worked in binding manuscripts. So he took the whole job of manuscript labor. And what he did was kind of like the standard work of a monastery. He was skillful in what he's doing, but he had no, I don't know how to put it, but you realize when you look at the manuscript made by Simon and made by Mariam, how the difference in space, how each one of them moved within the space that they had. This is an example of a colophon made by Simon. One thing also about how controlled he was is that he usually writes, okay, this manuscript is mine, and it becomes the monasteries after my death. But then, in more than half the cases, he adds this sentence. You see it in vertical line. This is to say that I am doing this based on the order of the bishop. In the first slide at all, he puts this sentence in between the lines. And then he says, this is because of the request of the bishop, and he adds the verification of his signature down. He was, I cannot say that he was forced, maybe, but he has to subject to some rules, to more rules about what to write, about the legal status of the manuscript than it seems in the case of Mariam. In this case, it's a very interesting case because for once, he wrote the very normal formula that he wrote, and you can see the remains of it around, but then he erased it, and then he wrote these two lines here, which say, I wrote this for myself to read it in my cell, but then I give it to my dear son, and then he writes a name, Nicola, son of John, and it seems that he finally has opportunity to donate his manuscript. But this is not everything, because up here, a note in the same, in his own hand, saying, this book has become an endowment of the monastery in the date mentioned here. It's intriguing to know why he's changed his mind. I'm not sure, again, that he's forced to do this. That's a possibility, but anyhow, all his manuscripts go to the monastery. When it comes to their education and skills, Mariam prays, ask for mercy of God to the teacher, to her teachers. Simon doesn't mention anything at all about his life. But we can know it's not only Simon who is a professional scribe, but Mariam also is a professional, although she is less skillful in terms of her handwriting, the layout of the manuscript, and her Arabic language, the grammar of her Arabic language. Obviously, she's not as skillful as him at all. In terms of skill, even without comparing to him, can I go to the first slide? Or... Yes. Yeah, so when you're a native speaker, or when you know Arabic, you can compare how the layout is well organized in case of Simon, and how even when she had a frame for the writing block, she was going up and down, and without a stable number of lines, plus the Arabic mistakes, she's missing many things about the grammar, putting the vowels in a very funny places. But how do we know that she was professional? Because, for example, she mentioned that the paper prices are more expensive this year. So it's, yeah, I can compare to previous years. Also, Mariam was a Syrian Orthodox. And when you read, you discover that this book is a liturgy, a dictionary of Eastern Syrian. And so she was doing work for other denominations. She's not doing ministry or service to her own denomination only. So although both of them were professional, Simon also had the chance to develop his skills. And this, as a scholar, Budalis, who studied the binding work of Simon, he mentioned that he noticed across the years, he learned some new strategies of binding. And I think this is the privilege of being part of a workshop in a community. We don't have other manuscript to see the development, but I can say that this manuscript is kind of primitive stage of the work of Mariam, and I don't know what happened later. So this is my first look at both of them, Mariam and Simon. What I want to do next, hopefully, is that I'm really missing so much about monasticism in the area of Mardin. I have been asking so many people, and it was really shocking and surprising to me that they all say, we're not sure, like, was there, like, if you know Mardin, there are like loads of men monasticism. So I was really like, what's going on? I'm still posing this question like scholar by scholar before going to middle list, but it doesn't seem clear so far. The next thing I wish to do is to divorce both of them. I feel like I was working already on Simon when Catherine asked me to come. And then I moved to female scribes because of the gender issue. So I felt that maybe like a non-Syrian Orthodox from the 16th century needs to be put more within more female scribes of the 18th that I found. Or if there are male scribes of the same denomination, I think they will be closer to her. Thank you so much.
No, you told me. Especially with the after edit. Hi.
So I've got 3 different titles for you. So let's see if we can make sense of it. This. Yeah. Yeah, she was very helpful with the project, so I felt like she deserved a starring role. Anyway, yeah. So hi. So basically, what I want to do today is talk a little bit through the paper that you all read, and then talk through sort of the project as I had originally intended it, and then sort of walk through, if you guys can help me sort of put those back together. I had originally intended this to be sort of a summary or a like sort of survey of Armenian female monasticism, starting in around Tripsime and then ending in New Jolfa at St. Catherine's. That is how I had originally intended the project, because I don't know, the idea of doing this survey of Armenian female monasticism and then stopping it before we had female voices made me really sad, Unfortunately, that is what you all read. So I would, like I said, that's sort of why I want to address this. So first of all, as you read in my paper, it is very, very, very difficult to piece out exactly what is going on in Armenian monasticism pre the 6th century. It is really difficult to tell whether there is any sort of Cenobitic monasticism, men, women, anything. It is really hard to tell whether we have women who are sort of in like a vaguely Syriac-y Binakiyama kind of environment where they're maybe part of like a really intense study group. We don't know if those women would live in a monastery or live outside of a monastery if there was a place for them to live. It is incredibly unclear. And the intense polyvalence of monastic terminology that we have sort of highlights that. It is really unclear, sort of, for example, the difference between a nun who could be a kos or a kusan, versus a hawatzeal, so a believing woman versus a nun? Is that potentially highlighting someone who is, not living in a monastery or a nunnery, but is, like believing and is sort of coming in there to do this sort of like prayer, worship, and like sort of learning circle, sort of in this Nakayama vibe? Or is that someone else who is just sort of like, a woman in her home who is believing, right? There are so many terms, and it's really hard to pin down in this really early period what any of them refers to. Especially, we have Thecla, who's referred to as a tikin, a lady, which again is not a kois. We have the Virgin Mary, who is exclusively referred to as a kois. So it again is really unclear exactly what any of these words are referring to. If we're able to piece out exactly when each one is used, it's still really difficult for that to be helpful in terms of figuring out exactly when Senomatic monasticism, male, female, whatever, starts to sort of spread in Armenia. However, as I mentioned again throughout the paper, there is this intense Syriac influence somehow. We see this Nakayama influence. We see this sort of covenantal language coming up, especially, I said next on my laptop and not on my clicker, but especially in this sort of covenantal language, we have a lot of really early and really important terms in Armenian that like are based around this ux word that comes potentially from this Syriac covenantal language. We see a lot of this in the Paustos Buzand, if that's a guy who's not, in his epic histories, we see a lot of this language. And there's a lot of theories that he is sort of, I don't want to say representative, but like that he is very entrenched in sort of very Syriac Armenian Christianity. So this sort of makes sense coming from that. But again, it really doesn't help us in terms of clarifying this question of Senomatic monasticism, when women were allowed to participate in it. And so for that, I turned to an incredibly fascinating article by Alison Faca called Death of the Door of the Carapat, where she relates the story of Mariam in the history of Tyrone. And that story for me fundamentally encompasses sort of so many of the tensions that we see going on in the writings of Stephanos Rebellion, in the writings of Mikhail Ghosh and Matthew Badessa, who are so angry at the existence of these female spaces. And for the sake of those of you who haven't read the paper, I'll sort of relate this narrative. Basically, there's this woman, Mariam, who is a very pious. She is immediately pious. That is like how she is introduced. She is pious. She is well respected. She is rich. She is well educated. She is everything that she should be in order to accomplish, like from the reader's opinion, a modern reader's opinion rather, of what her goal is of entering this monastery. So she, goes up to the door of this monastery. That's an incredibly important monastery of Glakabank. It's dedicated to John the Baptist. Again, it's really, really, really incredibly important. She really wants to go inside. She goes up to the door and she is stopped. They do not let her enter. Instead, the monks take her baby from her, who she's carrying in her arms. So they take her baby, they bring the baby inside of the monastery, sort of walk him around as like a proxy, and then put him back in her arms and say, okay, you've been here, you've been in the monastery, like you should feel, spiritually fulfilled now through your son. This is the access that you can have. But she's not particularly satisfied by that. So she immediately goes to act as a patron. So she brings them like food and gifts, and still they reject her entrance. Eventually, she gets fed up enough that she just sort of disregards and walks in anyway. She prays when she's inside, which is incredibly insulting. And then she provides food for all of the monks who are there, all 400 of them. They are refusing to feed her or refusing to, they don't even want her inside, but apparently they're happy to eat the food that she has provided for them. And this is really interesting because this, in addition to the fact that she's carrying her baby, right? So the entire time, her justification that she gives for why she should be allowed to enter this church is her alignment with the Virgin Mary. And she repeatedly stresses, everyone came from a virgin, or came from, a woman. Everyone drank breast milk, based on this spiritual nourishment that I am able to give as a woman through this universal act of breastfeeding, I should be able to enter the church. And she actually does this amazing thing when she feeds everyone. She is, again, sort of providing the spiritual nourishment through food to the community. So she is doing what she sets out to do at the beginning when she enters. However, again, the monks are grievously insulted by this. And one of them, after she leaves, says what I think is the most important line in the entire text, which is, he prays to John the Baptist, the patron or the associated saint with the monastery. His relics are interred there. And he says, you have to punish her. if she gets away with this, other women will do this too. Other women will think this is okay. And it's particularly that is the anxiety that he has there. It is not that the space is now defiled because she has been inside, though obviously that is part of it. But that's why like more women coming inside would be a bad thing. But it is critically important that men retain control and sole access to this kind of sacred space, which is really fascinating because that's not something that we see in a lot of like similar traditions. We see a lot of earlier female monasticism in Byzantium, in Western Europe, like really most other places where we have such intense male monasticism by like the 9th, 10th century. We also have similar communal, spatial female monasticism. And really still what we have in Armenia is women who are sort of doing asceticism, women who are doing sort of solitary, holy fool style desert asceticism. We have women who are sort of, in holes in the ground because they've caused some offense, so they sort of stay in the hole for the rest of their life. We have women in caves, we have women in huts, but we don't have women in spaces with other women. We really do not have that until we enter the Cilician period, which I think is fascinating because it's remarkably late again, like impressively late, at least in my opinion. But anyway, and again, what really adds to this is that we have in the 9th and 10th centuries a serious culture of female patronage and female donation. However, they're not patronizing nunneries. They're patronizing churches, they're patronizing cathedrals, other like very important buildings. And we have, I think that I included this in the paper, a couple different women who are like, their names are recorded on the side of the building as the patron in a place that is like very respectful as like sort of the primary patron. Like this is very clearly women who are doing significant patronage and yet not nunneries. However, like I said, suddenly in the Cilician period, something changes. I attribute a lot of the change to the presence of the Franciscans. However, I don't think that that can be like, I don't like that explanation. I don't think it's satisfactory enough. Or like, I don't think it's enough of the explanation. I think because there is so much intermarriage with Byzantium beforehand, I don't understand why this intense intermarriage with the Latins during the Crusader period is enough to sort of like intensely change this 1,000-year-old tradition sort of women not being in this monastic space. However, like it changes rapidly in this period. But interestingly, the Franciscans are a new group. So they don't have any prior claim to land or to buildings, to land, to anything in the Holy Land. So they're entirely dependent on donations, which I think is really interesting looking at this patronage moment. Potentially, it's possible that we suddenly see for the first time women who are able to patronage, like to do patronage to nunneries. If that's what's going on, it happens rapidly, right? Like it seems to be, if this is the first moment where people are sort of able and encouraged to do this, it starts to happen pretty rapidly. Like in Cyprus, by the end of the 1200s, I think we have 3 nunneries, and Cyprus is very small. Like the whole island, that we have 3 nunneries, right? As compared to like how many other ones we have elsewhere. It's pretty remarkable how fast things change in the Cilician period. Sorry. However, after the Cilician period is sort of the main one I want to talk about right now to sort of bring us back. Yes, okay. In the 17th century, we have a revival of the female deaconate by Moses. By the new Catholicos, Moses Tatowachi. So I'll just read that. One impulse to the foundation of convents and nuns, hermitages, and manuscript centers might have been the historical changes in the Armenian highland. In 1629, reform started with the new Catholicos Moses III Tatowachi, a kind of revival of Armenian monasticism and quite understandable, primarily in his native region, the region surrounding the Tatu monastery. He was also said to believe and promote the education of women and the role of women in the church. It was also Moses who was responsible for the founding of St. Catherine's Convent in Twelfth. Thus, his positive attitude towards the female monasticism and educated women might have influenced the founders of new nunneries and women's hermitages and their father superior. So this is a little bit about the foundation of some churches in the 17th century. I'll read the other quote. In the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, 1676, this church was constructed through the means of the handmaidens who have assembled here in the monastery and number 80 persons. Years after the building this house, some of us were moved to the area of Agulis, and having come here, they built this church by their labor with their honest earnings. It was begun on April 4th and completed on September 8th. So we see in this beginning, in 1676, there are 80 persons who assemble there, who live in this monastery, seemingly 80 virgins, and live and practice and pray and do monasticism communally together. However, by 60 years later, that number had dropped significantly. 150 nuns used to reside here. Again, that might be an exaggeration because we have the 80 in the previous number. It's possible that he's using hyperbole. But now there were only 12 penitents, and they were perplexed and had lost hope. I encouraged the penitents and noted all the essentials lacking in their church: books, a measure of cloth, chalice, and cross. Moreover, the outer chapel where men would stand when they came on a visit and the hermitage were dilapidated and in ruins. I had a carpenter brought with timber and planks, and handing him the cost of the materials and a craftsman, I bade him swiftly rebuild them and went on my way. I bought and dispatched all of the ecclesiastical vessels I could procure in the village of Tatev, and since they did not have flour for bread, I gave orders for some wheat from the monastery to be given to the nuns who had no means. So this is a pretty sad depiction of this monastery, or of a nunnery here, which is interesting. It's curious, this is not written right by our Moses, so it's possible that this is negatively inflected to still highlight some of those earlier biases. However, it really seems like for the most part, those biases are not still here. So this is probably a fairly neutral reflection of what's actually going on in the church in terms of the physical state of it. However, what's particularly interesting to me is this outer chapel where the men would stand. I'm really interested in these boundaries because as we look at the history of Tyrone and think about Mariam, she cannot enter the church at all. However, it seems very clear that by this point, that same sort of boundary doesn't exist in the other direction, right? There isn't this sort of intense, intensely female space in the same way. Obviously, there are still spaces that the men cannot and should not cross, but the outside of the nunnery itself, it's not a boundary that aligns with what is sacred and what is not, right? The men can still enter part of the sacred area. They can still enter this chapel, to be part of the service, but they still they're still separated, right? And also counterpoint, we have a couple monastic communities from around the same time period where it's hard to judge whether this is sort of covering for the fact that there are so few members, or this is actually how someone feels. But we do have an abbess who gives an example of, siblings don't get along. Why would we want to have, everybody in the world under the same roof? It is so much better, it's so much more peaceful. We can actually do our work and do our spiritual labor in this smaller community. When there's more people, there's less for us to do, and also we annoy each other, which I thought was very interesting because I don't usually see we annoy each other in things about nuns. Finally, I want to turn to St. Catherine's, which is our other very important monastery convent in this time period. It's in Ujolva, and it actually doesn't close until 1954. So it's very successful. It's open for a very long time. They have a girls' school. It's a fantastic institution. But again, I wanted to look at some of these canons, and specifically the presence of men in the part of running this nunnery. So as you see, the nunnery is to be governed by an executive body called the Board of Governors of St. Catherine's Nunnery, the members of which are to be experienced priests appointed by the bishop of the diocese and his vicar. We have men who are in charge. Again, we have men who are in charge every Saturday to oversee the regulation of internal life and financial situation. Again, more about financial situation, running the lands. So it's very clear that just how important, even in these sort of female spaces, just sort of how organized by male monasticism it still is. And specifically, I was really interested in this last canon, which does mention our abbess. However, she is only there to give the first warning. Again, everything in terms of an eventual leaving of the nunnery, if that's necessary, or a spiritual punishment, that is all still the responsibility of the bishop. The only thing that the abbess is doing here is giving this primary warning. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I also, in terms of women in monasteries doing labor, it is hard to talk about that without thinking about scribes, which of course is where I started this project. However, there are a lot of limits with colophon research, especially in Armenian. So in this colophon, the Psalter book from 1645, the scribe Lazar of Snuher again names his sister Margaret as a co-scribe, but also remembers the commissioner of the manuscript, the celibate Ripsime, and his celibate niece Sophia. So just like what we just learned about Arabic manuscripts, there are very standard patterns for colophons in Armenian as well. And something that's really complicated is a lot of people have looked at these manuscripts, seen female names, and got really, really excited and started going, oh my God, female scribes. But it's very difficult to tell which of these female scribes are female scribes, which of these female scribes are siblings who are mentioned in some of these colophons. We have like an Egishabeth, or it's not Elizabeth, it's like Armenian Elizabeth. I can't make that sound. But for a while, like she was thought to be a fairly prolific scribe, but now we think that she is not, and she is the sibling of a fairly prolific scribe. And rather like people have just been misreading these colophons. So this is something that like people are actively working on right now and like figuring out. And I unfortunately have not been able to see any of these manuscripts in person because COVID and stuff. So that's sort of hopefully part of where the project is headed, and also partially why the scribe focus sort of fell back a little bit. But we do have 3 women mentioned in this. We have a sister who is a co-scribe, whatever that means, whatever that implies. Potentially she's a scribe. We have Helene, who is another scribe who again is repeated, like her name comes up a lot in these colophons, sometimes in her own hand, sometimes in someone else's, as mentioned as sort of this co-scribe thing. We have the celibate Ripsime and his celibate niece Sophia. Again, it is unclear exactly whether they're celibate. It's sort of unclear which category of monastic women they could fit into. Going back to what I was talking about earlier with the terminology, that's still a confusing issue. But as is, I hope, clear from all that I've said, by the 17th and 18th century, deaconesses and abbesses were a feature of monastic life. That's just sort of a fact. In addition to that, ordaining deaconesses was not thought of as a new intervention or otherwise treated with the same suspicion as it has been in Cilicia. So in the Cilician period, as you guys read in the paper, Matthew of Edessa says that the ordination of women deacons is like the most grievous sin against God, which is like, I don't know, that's pretty intense. You know, the most grievous sin against God, right? Like that's a lot. So clearly opinions have changed. Moses is actively opening nunneries. He is actively, he is encouraging women to be educated. Like this is something that has clearly changed over the 13th to 16th century. And finally, Catholicoi, specifically Moses, but others, not only accepted the existence of nunneries, but not only actively supported them, but again, we're also able to go inside of them. So these boundaries that we saw earlier in the history of Tauron, with a woman really being completely unable to enter this sacred space, like seems to not exist in the other direction at all, right? It doesn't seem to be, like I said, there are obviously, I don't want to make it seem that like men could just wander through a nunnery, because obviously like that is not the case. However, this intense, like sacred, non-sacred at the edge of the monastery boundary, that does not seem to apply, right? Like she could not enter. There is no outside chapel for any of our women in the sort of, you know, pre-Cilician period to go to, when we have a woman who I mentioned is like literally in a hole in the ground until her death, for years, because she accidentally assaulted a bishop. And were there somewhere else for her to go, like this kind of like sort of chapel, presumably that's where she would have gone instead of like a hole in the ground. But we have all these women like in holes in the ground in huts, right? Like that's really all we have. Like this sacred boundary is so intense. And I really don't, honestly, in terms of Armenian monasticism, I don't know. It's really hard to posture like why this happened. And I don't really want to, because that's sort of a very open-ended question that I think I'm going to leave you with. But there's a potential. Some people think that this is due to like the Arabier, everything going on with sort of the masculinization of Armenian Christianity, due to that very early battle that became sort of a Christian military battle. There's scholarship that like argues that sort of that thread continued on and sort of became this like very militaristic masculine Christianity, which in turn completely just sort of banned women from these sacred spaces and from accessing these sacred spaces. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Really compelling, and I very much appreciate what you have invited us to think about in your papers, in your writing, and in your comments just now. And I will have to say that the manuscript production, of course, is really compelling for me. So much of my remarks will center on that, but I will try to make some connections where I've seen those connections, and I would love it if we can hear even a little bit more about the female scribal activity that you were able to trace, or that you have sort of been seeing as you work with your sources. I think this framing is extremely interesting, permitting us to explore relationships. So this is something that has sort of emerged from me, as we're thinking about this labor of female scribes, the effective agency that they are able to realize in these holy spaces of spiritual knowledge and of order, whether that is imposed or whether that actually sort of can be defined more independently. And so I see this coming in the communal nature of some of this work, the collaborations actually that we see, the relationship of patronage, right? And also of co-work in the manuscript production, whether that's the copying, the correcting, the collation, the binding, etc. But again, where we see the sort of female presence, I think in both papers is patronage, right? For the construction of buildings, perhaps, also potentially for the commission of manuscripts, but in this this very particular case where we have this exceptional copyist in Maryam from El Mansouriya, of a patron who is also female. So we'll explore that just a little bit, and then also something for me which is standing out in both is the challenge of, as it was put earlier, excavating, working with these sources and drawing out from these sources evidence for the activity of these, of the female scribes in particular. So ing to ambiguity in terminology, right? Like where there aren't necessarily gender distinctions. And then also, where we are sort of reliant on, sort of particular means of referencing and of and sort of recognition, to be able to associate femininity or womanhood, and so that is very much coming down to the importance of cataloging and navigating existing catalog data. So sort of to the point that was, most recently made about reading or revising readings of colophons and understanding of even the relationships, that are presented there, and then how to sort of make sense of that and translate that into some of the, exploration around these questions that we're actually able to do. Of course, as Evyn points out, the labor of manuscript production may not necessarily or exclusively be a social work or a communal work, but it is quite often that, right? And that's owing to the distribution of expertise, right? Or the imposition of order or practice, like within a workshop, such as Simon was, working in. And so, what's interesting for me to think about, given the relative dearth that we see, I was really, really struck by this figure: 18 out of 15,000. I mean, in terms of the data, if this is again, and this is a reflection of the the data, right, that's present, and the means of searching and so forth. But I mean, this is remarkably little. I mean, in terms of representation. So what's becoming more interesting for me to think about is what would compel women to take on this work. Like, we're seeing more that these seem to be the exceptional cases. And so what is driving those exceptions, right? I'm not convinced it's, simply a matter of convenience or of sort of, time or something like that. I think there must be something sort of more compelling than that. So, of course, we need to look to narrative sources. So, I mean, we have the manuscripts themselves. Manuscripts themselves are extremely important sources to be able to address many of these questions. It's paratextual traces that are found in the colophons, that are found in other notes, even though we do have these challenges with terminology and with ambiguity and so forth. And what is left unsaid, even when we do have information, what is left unclarified, or what is left. I know there are a few anonymous instances, or very little information said sort of about these female copyists and who they were, and their interests and their motivations. But those sources within the manuscripts themselves, of course, are extremely valuable. We can also look to these narrative sources, right, to try to have a deeper understanding, potentially around education and training. And also, sort of these reports that emerge when we find, so for example, just thinking to Armenian copyists, and even in just discussion of, a script and writing and elevation, these stories that are associated with particular women being copyists, to sort of, within these broader stories, women showing up basically in these roles. So these colophons in particular, they're they become these spaces. Certainly, there, especially for Armenian tradition, importance of memory is there. They're inscribing voice and memory for those that are making a record there, and they become these spaces of even creative expression, as we saw with the poetry that was being selected and was being included. So, yeah. So clearly, I mean, even in this broader context, we do have this sort of manuscript labor dominated by men, I think for me, where, as I mentioned before, kind of where we do see these few exceptions, and I'm incredibly interested in the directions that you will go in exploring these other, women that you have already identified. So not just those copyists, but I know that there were several other owners or patrons that you identified, binders, readers. Incredibly interesting to explore and understand what we can, about them, but also there's sort of, broader social contexts. So how were they engaging? I find it, particularly compelling to see women contributing as patrons, as I said before, and mirroring in that way sort of the social and sort of public engagement that you find women running and benefiting from endowments from Vox. And I really have to think about sort of how this work is being conducted, and how these women are acquiring this knowledge and this skill to be able to apply it in these circumstances where we are seeing it. So for example, I found it quite interesting that among these, this sort of 18 that you were able to identify for this Christian Arabic manuscript context, we have 13 who are nuns. 4 of those were daughters of clergy, and then 2 came from families that were involved in manuscript labor, right? So they were either scribes or collectors or traders, as you've identified. And actually the others were anonymous, right? So, I mean, in your reading. So And again, the idea of nun, as we've seen in the case of Miriam, not necessarily implying institutional presence or activity, which I think is extremely interesting, right? Like to, to sort of potentially profess. This was a question I had, sort of what stage was Miriam like, to have taken this title and seemingly somewhat hesitantly present it just based on, just a reading of what she indicated. She's very self-deprecating that she barely deserves to be called, nun, right? So it's sort of what stage in her training, was she? But in any case, like to have this very close connection with this sort of established order, the potential for for learning, and then also for training and for access to manuscripts. And this is another thing I want to turn back to, because I'm extremely interested in what exemplar Miriam in particular may have been working from, and how did she gain access to that manuscript. So I have some thoughts about that. I have some ideas about that, but in any case, I also find it extremely compelling, and I'd like to kind of latch onto this a little bit. This title Rabbana that she utilizes, that implies this learning and education. It also shows up in her the patron and her family. So because to me it seems that there may be some clarity to be found in pursuing that context of learning and education. The patron also being the daughter of a learned man, and of her mother, of a woman who's identified as daughter of a deacon. I found it also quite interesting that in this context where Miriam, the copyist, is choosing to specifically call out these women, right, and those relationships and those ties, she also took a moment for extended special appreciation to the patron's father, like for the effort that he exerted, in contributing to the labor of this manuscript production. And I wonder if that level of detail that she sort of goes into could suggest some sort of special relationship, like between Miriam and the patron or the patron's family. I know that we see that, and forgive me that I'm not speaking from images, but if I had, I would put a couple of images of the colophon up here. So we see that this manuscript is copied in a particular beit, or what we're sort of reading as a private house, right? And she does, I notice, seem to indicate that her parents and her teacher have passed away. And I know this is something that you mentioned in terms of thinking about could she sort of be an orphan who has come under the protection of this family, etc. But again, another thought I have in thinking, how old is she? Is she potentially quite young? Is she very early in pursuing sort of the path of a novice and eventually a nun? And could even this house or this household, could this have been a site of a collection where she was able to access manuscripts, and even the manuscript, potentially from which she was working when she copied out this manuscript? Another fascinating thing that I noticed in the colophon is that further along, so she uses naktub. So she uses the plural we to indicate again potentially the contributions of the patron, the contributions of the patron's father to sort of the collective production, but it clearly points to a social or collaborative work, and so I think that's really interesting. Another thing that I appreciated in terms of what you touched on is this. What might be seen as a sort of self-deprecating expression, but I think is very important to think about, is she says that she is reer like she's not a professional, I think is how, you know, sort of you were reading it. I mean, and that yet, you know, she demonstrated skill, she demonstrated some professionalism, right? Like in terms of being willing to work on a text sort of outside of her liturgical tradition potentially, and, you know, and so forth, being mindful of the interests of the patron in the production of this manuscript, the expense of the paper, etc. So she shows signs of this sort of familiarity, right, with the work of manuscript production and the implications, but also, you know, taking on this sort of self-deprecating description of herself, indicating that, but you know, that this may be something that is not routine, right? Like this is something that is, again, exceptional. That this is something, you know, that is sort of out of the ordinary, out of the, I don't know, more institutionalized or structured sort of work. So I think then it again becomes then more interesting for me to think about what motivated her to do this, right? I think it would be really valuable, of course, to look to see what was taking, as you are proposing to do, to see what was taking place in women's convents, you know, to what degree was any scribal activity sort of going on, and especially, you know, I've been thinking about this role of nun, and even this, you know, this title, this sort of learned title, and this ability to sort of access knowledge. So engagement in manuscript production at the level of craft, so sort of beyond patronage, it requires highly specialized knowledge and training, and that could be imparted formally, or that could be imparted informally. It can be imparted in communal settings, or it can be imparted privately with tutors. And Miriam is very careful to mention her teacher, like, right? And that comes with exposure, it comes with sort of practice, right? And it comes with access, again, to models, to materials, to tools, you know, and to sort of ability to kind of experiment and to work and to actually engage in that handwork. So I wonder if it's through, you know, this role that is, you know, that is mediating this access, and these networks and these connections. So certainly for the opportunity to learn, to gain a knowledge of the language, to gain a knowledge of the script, to gain a knowledge of the liturgies and of the texts, and you know, in some ways this is similar to me to this accessibility of literary production through you know, particular languages and scripts. So yes, there's a lot here. I'm also extremely you know, fascinated in terms of access to you know, to sort of the barriers that Lauren was discussing, and the idea of women being present again for learning, right, as deaconesses, as preachers, as, you know, spiritual leaders, and as teachers of other women, and being present in order to, you know, to facilitate that. Yes, I think we have now so many more questions. Probably these were questions that we may have already been asking, but I feel like you've left us with some really, really fascinating things to mull over. And thank you so much. And thank you all. Yes, please.
Thank you for all these questions. It's nice to. So you reversed the question in a very nice way. What forces them to work as scribes? I actually asked the question, what prevents them from working as scribes? This was my initial question. I'm asking this mainly because I see in the same period, in the same milieu, in the same women, they work with waqf, they work with endowments, which are kind of, might be buildings, not only a manuscript, but a whole building that will make food for the people, or kind of hostel or whatever, or a church or whatever. And they seem to be very involved in this process, which seems to me more a social act. And here we are speaking about a work that you can do alone, you can do in a workshop, you can do with your friend. So whatever the boundaries set for a woman in a community, she can do manuscript labor. And that's why what surprised me about the number. When I come to the number, we as catalogers, we didn't start to pay attention to the marginal notes and to the colophons until very recent. So I'm hoping that there will be more women discovered. Simply, when I was searching, I used the word for wife of, daughter of, in Arabic and in Syriac and in English. With different spellings to find as much as possible. But I'm sure that some of the women not even mentioned in the cataloging, and now they are, we add more every day. So maybe I don't know how many more I will find, but hopefully I will find more. I feel we are going around the point of education so much, because what else would prevent a woman from being a scribe but if she's illiterate, or if this is considered very intellectual work for a woman? I don't find this, but I remember a case where a manuscript is endowed by a father to his daughter, and he clearly says that if she decided to go to a monastery, the manuscript goes to another one. So it's still kind of supervised. It's not complete, what to say, like she doesn't have freedom of having her property even when she got it. It seems that Maryam and the commissioner, Mahabbatullah, they were in good communication. Maryam, although she was under two institutional structures, somehow she had a voice that was not available to other women. Like two institutions didn't project more rules and more regulations on her, but the other way around, she was able to express herself. She was able to have a space to write what she wants. Part of her poetry actually is kind of like encouraging learning and gaining knowledge, which is very interesting in terms of what she's doing. I'm coming again and again to how they were educated, and how they were educated in terms of reading and writing, and in terms of the skills that a craft requires. About the access to the material, the normal process is that if I want to copy a manuscript, I will bring the exemplar because I want to copy a specific text. So this is a normal practice, but I'm not, of course, I don't have any specific information about this. How old is she? Yes. I felt, I cannot say, I'm sorry to say that I don't know many times, but I didn't feel that she's a little girl. I didn't feel that she's young. Yeah, I don't know, but I cannot say more. When she says there are some standard formulas for colophons, as we all know, and when she says, forgive me because I am not a professional scribe or I'm not a scribe, this is also kind of humbleness. Usually, I see men who write, forgive me because I am 8 years old. Of course, never. Or I'm 11 years old. I see this many times, and I feel like baby scribes are like, it's not. Yeah, so Mary actually was, as a friend of mine said, she was a freelance nun. Yeah, I'm looking forward to read more her poetry and see if there are more aspects to speak about.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for a really fascinating panel. I had a question for Lauren. And I was curious about the trope of women as holy fools. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how your sources represent that trope and what kind of tensions you read into it. And the reason why I ask is because a lot of the foundational male figures of the Armenian church are also kind of holy fools, like Grigor Lusevoric, the founder of the church, also spends a lot of time in a pit. Machko is the inventor of the alphabet in the 5th century, ends his life by going off into the wilderness and just crying while praying all day long. And his followers come with him, but it's kind of ambiguous whether he actually wanted them to. And so I kind of wonder, at the time these sources are written, and male monastic traditions are becoming more established, if they are anxious about these female figures that are actually emulating the real founders of the Armenian church before monasticism was really a thing, even though we read it back into those sources all the time.
Absolutely. So I love your question. So one of the things that I didn't include in this, but a very long footnote in my paper, I just sort of like listed a bunch of women who fit this trope. So first of all, obviously there's Sandoks. So just think Thecla, for those of you who are more unfamiliar. She's very much an apostle, sort of in the Thecla sense of being an apostle, but rather like later on in the Thecla tradition in Greek Orthodoxy, she sort of gets more and more silent and more like a follower of Paul. And Sandoks is very much not that. She is very much a preacher. She is very much an apostle. And that doesn't seem to be causing a particularly like strong amount of anxiety. We have Saint Sushanek, who's the daughter of Bard Mamikonian, who lives in Ascetic, alone in a small hut after the apostasy of her husband, Prince Vazgen. She's very important. She doesn't seem to cause a lot of anxiety. After the Battle of Aravayer, which I mentioned, when we have all of these wives who are suddenly stripped of all of their husbands, but also comes with the husband, their protection, their money. We, again, don't see them band together in any sort of like real communal sense. We really at the most have groups of 2 or groups of 3 at the like really, and that seems to be like very, very emphasized. So I think they're pointing out there actually that they're doing this holy fool thing instead of doing a sort of communal, like that those particular women are sort of doing that trope. They really don't, that really does not seem to cause a huge amount of stress. On the other hand, like Ripsime, who is of course a nun in like the very traditional sense of being a nun, lives theoretically in a convent, also doesn't seem to cause a huge amount of anxiety, right? She is, I mean, I don't know how many Armenians you guys know, but the vast majority of those that I know are named Ripsime, right? Like she's clearly a figure who people love, revere, right? Despite being a woman who lives inside the cloister. Obviously, like her position at the center of, Armenian Christianity, like the conversion and everything, gives her a little bit of a special status, but like that doesn't seem to be an intense amount of anxiety there either. So I do think it's really interesting. Again, this is something that we have like throughout Armenian history. Like almost every author has a holy fool woman to talk about, with the exception of, like I said, in the paper, in all of Armenian literature that I looked at and then I looked at sources that looked at, we have like one person. We have one queen who retires to a monastery, and then the monastery disappears from history after she retires there. It is unclear whether she is, how historical she is. However, like all of our holy fools are much more historical, are much like they are grounded, they are given, they're related to the Macedonians, they are like grounded in time and space. Like we know where some of these caves are theoretically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually I have a follow-up comment. So the Battle of Avadai, to me, the most interesting thing about that text, where the Armenians go off and fight the Persians, and then the men all die, and then this holy martyrdom, whatever, and then the women are left behind, like you say, is the text genders them all as men at the end, and it says they're manly and they're suffering. To go back to suffering, and they take on in their womanly spiritual labor the attributes of the male warriors who don't exist anymore. And so I think that, just to gently suggest that maybe there is room for thinking about tensions in these texts where the men are gone and the women are in charge, and that cannot be. So they have to become men. The women become men. We were talking about like masculine Armenian Christianity. It comes from these women.
I didn't actually, sorry, just going back to her Sina, she also, of course, like when she's battling Turdos, she's also like a man. So I think you're probably right, but that's something to push at.
Yeah, just sort of thinking about like, why did they have to get gendered in these ways? And just what are the power structures at the time?
Definitely, no, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This is really exciting. And I have just short questions for both of you. So for Vevian, I was wondering, I'm really interested in your discussion about the different choirs and how it sounds like Mariam was personally responsible for at least managing something about the choir production, or how are they labeled, or are they labeled in the manuscript? Because that'd be interesting, right? Because she's copying, right, for you said like an East Syriac church text. She is a member of the Syriac Orthodox Church, right? And I know at this time from what I've worked on with these manuscripts is that sometimes they're written in Arabic or Darshuni or in Syriac, and then the way that the choirs are labeled are actually in a different language. And so I'm wondering if you could talk more about that. And I can ask my question for Laura.
I know that she's the one who made the choirs because it's her handwriting who made the signatures, and she did it in a very unique way. I'm not sure if it's clear. On the first page, she used the abjad system, like Alif, Ba, Jim, Dal. So she wrote on the first page of, she wrote Alif on the first page of the choir, and then she wrote Alif again at the last page of the choir, the same choir. And then the next page was the second choir, she wrote Ba, and she made some kind of illumination around each letter, and at the end page of the choir she wrote again the back. So that's how she divided the choirs, and it's her handwriting. So
she has her own system.
I don't usually see at the beginning and at the end of the choir together. Like usually it's one sign.
This is really interesting because that's very common in like East Syriac manuscripts from this region, from like the 17th through the 19th century. They label, like, instead of using catchwords or numbering their pages, they label the beginning and the end of the choir.
So maybe this comes from the exemplars that she used.
I'm wondering because even though they are in Syriac,
Maybe.
they actually have Arabic numbering for the choirs. So it's an interesting. This is just like very fascinating, and I love to talk about.
One thing about she used more than once. She was writing a word, and then she, in the middle of the word, she turns to write a Syriac letter instead of Arabic, and then she kind of not cross it, but she repeats the correct word again.
Yeah.
And she used more. At least I saw it once in the colophon. A Syriac word translated into Arabic letters. So she seems she has some knowledge of Syriac.
It's really interesting, kind of pulling on that thread. How you talked about like a freelance copyist. It's interesting because this is 16th century.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, kind of at that time, right? It's still very much past the period where the Syriac Orthodox and East Syriac churches had already switched to Arabic.
Mhm.
But in these communities around Martin and the Turantine, there was still like a very high level of Syriac literacy. So I'm wondering if she's like, oh, you need someone someone who can make an Arabic manuscript for you. I know of a woman, right, or something like that. But it's really interesting. So thank you so much.
This is possible, yeah, but this is also part of women monasticism that I need to look at.
I don't want to take up all my time. So Lauren, we can talk afterward.
Armin, you have a question?
Yeah, sure. I first of all, thank you both of you for such wonderful presentations. I had a question for Lauren, if I could. First of all, just this journey through female development in the communal piety, mind blowing. I'm sorry to jump into the weeds here, so maybe we can talk about this more later. But just to touch on this, I was really interested in your discussion of monasticism in the Cilician period. That's kind of my own area of interest. So particularly, I was wondering if you could expand a little more on the influence of the Franciscans in like allowing for female participation in like a monastic complex. Like the Franciscan order is not something I'm super comfortable with, but one of like the main things I think of is like tension between allowing women to participate. Like I'm thinking specifically of St. Clair of Assisi. So
Yeah, I went there right there too.
Okay.
I was very, very confused. This Franciscan style is very peripatetic. And that is not what women are doing in this time period. It just doesn't like, you sort of can't do the holy pool thing in the 12th century. Like society sort of moved on. It doesn't really work anymore. I was shocked to find this Franciscan influence. I'm not a scholar of the Cilician period. I mostly work in late antiquity. But I loved the Crusades in undergrad, and so I sort of came back and it was fun. But anyway, I like did not realize this, but St. Francis himself actually went to Damietta and attempted to convert a sultan, was not killed for that somehow. And then, but so he himself actually went on a crusade, which first of all, I was completely unaware of. But like I said, I think a very important thing here is the fact that the Franciscans didn't have prior land, because a lot of the other orders that are over there already owned things. And so when the Crusaders are able to like take polities back, the orders that already own those buildings are then able to reuse, like to have back those buildings, whereas the Franciscans don't have anything. So they're entirely dependent on people in the 12th century patronizing them to create these new buildings. Everything that they are building, every Franciscan thing is new. So that's sort of something that I'm pushing at and sort of like, is this a moment where women are really enthusiastic about monasticism because they're able to, and they're sort of jumping at the chance? I don't know. They are actively founding houses of Poor Clares, seemingly like more intensely than they are in Western Europe. Again, I don't know. I don't know that much about Poor Clares in Western Europe, so maybe that's not true. But like in Cyprus, in 100 years, we have 3. Like that is fantastic. Like that is such intense proselytization to be that successful, right? We have like Hetam, one of the kings of Cilician Armenia, eventually himself converts and becomes a Franciscan. He like steps down from the throne a couple times and like converts, and things are complicated. But like there's this real intense integration of the Armenian royal and like leading families with the Franciscan identity. And so I think it's both that the Franciscans are giving people an opportunity to be monastics. I think it's that they like are just really successful in getting in with the nobility in this part of Cilician Armenia. And so there's a fair amount of like top down, but that's where all the money is. That's where they can patronize. But also, this isn't just something that's happening in the Cilician period. As I mentioned in the paper, like we have a convent of Benedictine nuns that convert to Poor Clares. This seems to just be a very popular movement in this milieu. There's the particular kind of Franciscans that they're talking to are called like the spirituals. And again, I don't really know that much about Franciscans, but it seems to be a very kind of austere Franciscanism. And so it's possible that again, that was particularly appealing somehow within the Armenian church. Going back to this sort of like ascetic holy fool idea, it's possible that that's helpful there. And then again, the province of Terra Sancta eventually expands and includes all of Cilicia. And they just like really intensely proselytize in Cyprus and Cilicia, and clearly are very successful to the point that by the 17th century period, this is not thought of as an outside invention, right? Like, so that's what I was trying to highlight, and I don't know how much I successfully did today. But this Cilician period proselytization is so successful that like this is really thought of by a fairly like short amount of time later as something that is a continuation of like previous Armenian tradition. Like this is not treated with suspicion. It is not thought of as a sort of like weird Western feminizing influence in the way that sort of I think Matthew Modesta sees it. This is really something that is just Armenian tradition and is to be encouraged. And so I think that like, sort of points to just how successful the Franciscans were, in my opinion, in Cilicia.
Let's maybe throw out a couple of Franciscan related on the Western.
Yes, please do.
side. So I guess one would be that attending the initial development of the clairs is a very sharp distinction between the mendicant roaming monasticism that the men are allowed, Francis and his followers are allowed to participate, and the cloistered state of the clairs, but then a kind of another option through the tertiaries who are a little bit not as strictly kind of following of monastic vows and can kind of live in secular society but follow monastic vows sort of opens up. And so it'd be interesting to see kind of the conditions according to which your women who are associating themselves with Franciscanism are, what they're following. And then you get this kind of split between the conventuals and the spirituals sort of who become very austerely observant that takes place a little later. And again, it offers a model. So it would just be interesting to see how they define their, sort of monasticism or practice that emulates elements of monasticism. And then I think the other was that the Franciscans also get kind of designated the keepers of sites in the Holy Land in Jerusalem. And so it would sort of, again, that becomes a sort of association with so just things to throw out.
All really helpful. Yeah.
At this point,
I think
Yeah,
we have
there's
another
another
question.
question.
It's just a minor, just a question, because I haven't read the text in a while, but I was wondering, because I remember the way that I learned about it was the story with the cut and Phipsima. Is that more the masculinization of Phipsima to defeat the cut, or the feminization of the cut? Be overwhelmed by
I think it's both. I think
okay, I wasn't sure if the text actually explicitly says either. That's why.
I think she explicitly does say, like, I'm just gonna keep pull up the text. I'm pretty sure she explicitly does
She does actually become
like a man. I think that does happen. But I will double check that.
I just can't remember.
I will double check that. But I do think that.
hey, so
So,
Godfred has a
so thank you.
announcement.
Thank you all. So first of all,